They dropped a ruined warship on Earth like trash. The Empire quietly decommissioned its fleet. The first thing Earth's instruments recorded was not a flash or a boom. It was a Tuesday. The Solen's Grief entered the atmosphere at 6:14 Pacific Standard, and the sky above Baja California went white in a stripe 40 kilometers wide. Fishing vessels off Ensenada reported the shadow passing overhead before the sound arrived, a low, tearing pressure that cracked windshields from the coastline to the ridge towns inland. Then the impact. 40,000 tons of gutted Aurelian cruiser hitting the Pacific at terminal velocity, 11 kilometers offshore, and the water did not splash so much as it vanished in a column of steam that topped 300 meters before the cameras found it. The seismographs registered from Manila to Santiago. Vey's broadcast arrived 9 minutes later, not after 9 minutes after, which meant it had been cued before the hull hit water. He had not waited to see the impact. He had staged the message in advance, the way you'd schedule a filing receipt, and sent it the moment the hull cleared Atmo. Every frequency Earth used, every band, every protocol, civil, military, scientific, the dead frequencies nobody transmitted on anymore. All of them. His voice was unhurried. That was the detail that stayed with people afterward, the one that turned up in accounts years later when they tried to describe the morning, not what he said, but the register he said it in. Mildly amused, the way a person sounds when they are explaining something obvious to someone who already ought to know. A gift, since you have no use for real ones. Consider it recycling. We understand your species values that. A pause, 2 seconds calibrated. Scrap doesn't scheme, enjoy the trash. Then silence. Then the frequencies went back to Earth's own noise. Weather alerts, shipping coordinates, the breakfast program still playing in apartment blocks from San Diego to Tijuana. Earth's governments confirmed the obvious by noon. This was not an attack. Nothing had been targeted. The hull had been disposed of into sovereign territory the way an empire disposes of things it no longer wants, without particular care about where they land, because care implies that the landing matters. The official assessment, shared across 14 national security councils in a 48-hour window, used a phrase that would become common: categorization event. Humanity had been categorized. Waste tier disposal candidate, the compact's own designation system made it clean. You were not invaded when you were categorized. You were simply filed. The Solen's Grief sat in 62 meters of water, listing 4 degrees to port. Its dorsal array collapsed. Its hull skin buckled along the entire port quarter from reentry stress. It was enormous. Even at distance, the survey drones sent by the Mexican government on the second day showed a vessel roughly the length of a mid-sized city block, mostly intact below the waterline, its gutted interior visible through a hull breach near the stern where the armament bays had been stripped before disposal. Stripped before disposal. That detail appeared in every survey report and in no press coverage. Fleet Marshal St. Vey closed the incident file 73 minutes after the broadcast. He was aboard his flagship, 3 systems from Earth, in his private office, a narrow room of dark paneling and 2 displays, where he kept his working files separate from the administrative system his aides managed. He initialed the closure himself. He issued no monitoring order. No retrieval mandate, no orbital watch assignment, no follow-up survey request. These were not oversights. The compact's administrative doctrine was precise about resource allocation. Sustained observation implied the possibility of change, and a category once filed was not changed without evidence of genuine reassessment threshold. Earth had not met a reassessment threshold in 4 previous review cycles. The hull was logged as disposed. The disposal coordinates were recorded. File closed. He had meetings. This is the part you need to understand. Vey was not stupid. His file on Earth was accurate for what it documented, coal still burning in half the inhabited landmass by compact census, technological ceiling 2 full rungs below the threshold for basic intersystem transit, no evidence of exposure to functional Aurelian systems beyond brief military encounters that Earth had not survived in any meaningful capacity. The Solen's Grief had been stripped of all armament before disposal. Her core was running on minimum backup power, starved, not dead, but nothing in Vey's data suggested the distinction mattered. A starved core in the hands of a waste-tier species was not a resource. It was a component from a device they could not read, in a language they could not speak, using an architecture they had no documented exposure to. That was the foundation of his blind spot. Not that humans were weak, but that Aurelian systems architecture was beyond them to parse. His compact had spent 6,000 years building and refining that architecture. Waste-tier worlds had never, in the compact's full administrative history, demonstrated any capacity to interface with it. The gap was not of degree, it was categorical. And a categorical gap, in Vey's doctrine, was not a thing you monitored. You simply noted it in the file and moved on, because monitoring implies the possibility that you missed something, and you cannot miss something that cannot exist. He did not look back. 3 systems away, the Solen's grief listed 4 degrees in the dark and the cold of the Pacific, and its core, starved, not dead, waited in the wreck the way a thing waits when it doesn't know it is waiting. On the 3rd day after impact, a woman named Dr. Amara Os signed off on a survey request, routed through the joint academic consortium attached to the Mexican Oceanographic Authority, filed as a REC documentation study, entirely routine in form. She was not a marine biologist. She was a systems linguist who had spent 6 years studying the fragmentary Aurelian communication, intercepts that Earth's military had gathered, unsuccessfully, from the 3 brief conflict windows that had ended badly enough that Earth didn't describe them as wars. She had read every piece of Aurelian signal data Earth possessed. She had published 4 papers that nobody outside a very specific academic community read, on the structural grammar of Aurelian maintenance protocol communications, the low-level system-to-system language that compact vessels use to coordinate internally. She had a hypothesis about starved cores. The survey drones she sent on day 3 were not documentation drones. They carried instruments calibrated for one specific reading. Was the core dead or starved? The result came back in 4 hours. Starved. She read the result twice, set the tablet down on the edge of her desk, and did not pick it up again for 6 minutes, not because she was processing it, but because she wanted to be certain she was calm before she picked it up. Then she made a list of 8 names, people she trusted absolutely, people who could be quiet. She did not call them. She drove to see each of them in person over the following week, one at a time. Stay close. What happens next took 9 years, and the most frightening part isn't the ending. It's how quiet the middle was. 2 weeks after impact, Earth's silence was being read across the wider galaxy as confirmation of the obvious. Vey had not been monitoring, but others were lesser powers, neutral observers, trade bloc administrators, and they were watching for Earth's response with the low, comfortable curiosity of those who already know the answer and are waiting to see it confirmed. No military mobilization, no diplomatic communication to the compact, no formal protest filed through the trade authority channels, which was the established procedure for waste-tier worlds that wished to register grievances. Nothing. The galaxy read this the way Vey had read it, a species that received a message and had no answer to give. They were half right. Earth had no answer yet. But in a rented research facility built on a converted offshore platform 40 kilometers south of the impact site, close enough that the grief's outline was visible on clear days as a dark shape just below the surface, 8 people had just agreed to try to learn one. And one person, the 9th, was already doing the math on how long it would take. Osai's first calculation, 9 years minimum, probably more. Her second, they had time, because the compact had already signed paperwork confirming they wouldn't be looking. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she started a new document, typed a project name at the top, and began. The project name she typed was Ledger. She chose it because a ledger records what is owed and what has been paid. She did not explain this to anyone on the team. It seemed obvious enough that it didn't need saying. The 9 of them began in the 4th week after impact, working out of the converted platform 40 kilometers south of the wreck, close enough that on clear mornings, when the light came in flat and low across the water, you could see the dark mass of the hull just below the surface like a bruise that wouldn't resolve. The platform had been a weather monitoring station, then a communications relay, then nothing. Now it had encrypted uplinks, 3 server racks cooling in the humidity, and 8 cots in a room that used to be a storage bay. Os had the original supervisor's cabin. She slept in it about 4 hours a night. She did not apply for funding. This was the first decision that her team took a while to accept. A project of this scale, 9 years by her first estimate, running on whatever resources they could quietly redirect, Felt like the kind of thing that needed institutional backing, oversight committees, a budget line somewhere. Osai's position was different. The moment you put this in a budget, she told them, you put it in a record and records have readers. The compact had 6,000 years of administrative practice and 190 worlds in its system. The one thing it knew how to do was find the thing you filed. So they filed nothing. They bought equipment through 8 separate procurement channels, all plausibly attached to existing research programs. The server racks came in as oceanographic processing hardware. The power draw was registered as a wave energy study. The team's salaries came through 4 different institutional accounts, none of them cross-referenced. They were 9 people living off a platform in the Pacific, working on the most consequential project in Earth's history, and they looked, from the outside, like marine scientists with a generous equipment budget. The first 18 months were grammar lessons. A starved core does not run. It ticks low-level maintenance cycles, system state broadcasts on a loop, the equivalent of a heartbeat in a system too depleted to do anything but keep itself technically alive. What the core was broadcasting was not useful data. It was the Aurelian equivalent of a sleep signal, structured, formal, completely uninformative. But it was structured, and Osai was a linguist before she was anything else. She had 6 years of intercept data from Earth's 3 failed contact windows, fragmentary, partial, mostly the kind of thing you get when a transmission ends before the reply arrives. She had worked with this data long enough to recognize the Aurelian Maintenance Protocol register, the specific grammar that compact systems used when they were talking to each other rather than to anything external, not the language of commands or broadcasts, the internal language. The one the compact used to coordinate vessel systems, run diagnostics, schedule handshakes across a fleet. The core's sleep signal was in that register. It's the only language it's still running, she told her team on the 3rd night, pointing at a waveform display. Everything else is powered down, but this it keeps going because this is what it uses to say I am still here to any other Aurelian system that might be listening. No other Aurelian system was listening. The compact had not sent a listening post. There was nothing to hear by their reckoning. I was going to learn to say I am still here back. By month 8, she had mapped the sleep signal's full grammatical structure. It was not simple. Aurelian Maintenance Protocol was not a human language and did not behave like one. It was layered with simultaneous registers that carried different classes of information in parallel, the way a piece of music carries melody and harmony at once. Earth's intercept data had shown her the surface register. The core showed her the depth. She had 2 problems. The first was power. Feeding the core enough to wake it from a sleep signal to active response required a graduated approach, because too much power applied incorrectly would trigger the core's diagnostic protocols and lock the system in a failure state. She needed to feed it the way you'd coax a fire from a coal that had been banked for days, slow, specific, patient. The second problem was worse. She could read the grammar of the sleep signal. She could not yet produce fluent output in the maintenance protocol register, because fluency requires live models. You do not learn to speak a language from a recording of someone sleeping, even a good recording. She needed live Aurelian systems communicating in real time. No live Aurelian systems were near Earth. She presented the problem to the team at the end of month 8 without drama, because drama would not help. They needed people inside the compact's operational sphere. Not military operatives. The compact would notice military operatives. They needed contractors. Waste-tier contractors working inside the compact's own labor ecosystem. The scrap processing operations the compact ran on its mid-tier disposal worlds, where gutted hulls were broken down, stripped further, processed for raw material. These sites ran on waste-tier labor hired under short-term contracts, because mid-tier labor cost more and the work was considered beneath skilled personnel. The systems at these sites were live Aurelian Maintenance Protocol architecture, actively communicating, running in real time. She looked at the team. 2 people raised their hands. Osai looked at them for a moment. She said she needed to think about it, and everyone else left the room, and she sat with the 2 of them, a structural engineer named Yusuf Diallo and a systems technician named Priya Venkatesh, and she told them precisely what the work would mean. Embedded identities, false contractor registries, multiple rotations across 3 waste-tier worlds, years of this, not months. They would be inside the compact's labor system, in reach of the compact's administrative apparatus, working on compact equipment, in a role that was legitimate on its surface and would not survive examination beneath it. Diallo said he understood. Venkatesh said she wanted a week to think. She came back in 4 days. They left on a cargo transit 8 months later, traveling through a trade authority relay point under names that did not belong to them. Not falsified exactly, but registered through a chain of documentation that 3 people on the team had spent 6 months building. The compact's contractor intake process was thorough, but not investigative. It verified that the registry existed, not that the person behind it was who they said they were. No waste-tier species had ever attempted to infiltrate compact operations. The intake system was not built to catch something it had never been asked to catch. The same blind spot that let Vey walk away from a starved core was the blind spot that let 2 human engineers walk into the compact's own scrap processing sites under paper identities. Osai did not watch them go. She was already back at her desk, working on the power feed sequence. The years built slowly. Diallo and Venkatesh rotated across 3 sites, 2 in the compact's outer disposal sector, 1 on a reclassified world closer to the core territories. They spent their first rotation watching, not participating, not interfering, observing live compact systems running maintenance protocol in real time, recording everything they could within the access their contractor status provided. This was legitimate work. They processed scrap, filed materials assessments, attended the safety briefings. They were diligent contractors. Nobody looked twice. What they brought back from the first rotation was 4 months of live maintenance protocol data. Osa spent 3 months working through it, then she went back to the core. The core spoke maintenance protocol the way a native speaker speaks, not as grammar rules applied to a form, but as something structural, prior to rules. She had been learning the rules. Now she had enough live data to hear the structure underneath them. The difference was like the difference between knowing the fingering for a chord and hearing the chord played by someone who has played it 10,000 times. You could see what you had been missing. The second rotation was longer. Venkatesh came back with a vocabulary problem. The disposal site on the reclassified world used a regional variant of the protocol, and she wanted to document the variants precisely. She went back for a third rotation. Diallo stayed home and helped Osai apply the first rotation's data to the core's restoration sequence. The core was not awake, but it was less asleep. That was how they described it to each other, less asleep. More present. Responding to precisely calibrated input, starting to produce output that went beyond the sleep signal into something they could call a reply. By year 4, the core was in active dialogue with Osai's restoration system. Not fluent, not yet, but present, running, responsive, producing Aurelian maintenance protocol output in the depth register, not just the sleep signal surface. Osai documented each step of the restoration sequence with the same care she had documented the grammar work. Irreversible progress at each stage. Once the core was at a given level of restoration, it could not be pushed back without destroying what had been built. She thought of it as teaching something to walk. You could not unteach it without breaking it, and breaking it would cost them years they had agreed not to spend twice. Year 4 also brought Ledger's wall. She had known it was coming. The hull had been stripped before disposal. The compact standard decommissioning protocol removed armament, navigation override, and propulsion control before a hull was disposed of. What remained was sensors, internal communications, maintenance protocol architecture, and the registry. The compact did not bother removing the registry because registry entries cost nothing, and removing them costs administrative time. Vey's hull was still in the compact's records as the Solen's Grief, still carrying its original identifier, still technically a vessel in the compact system, just one filed as decommissioned and disposed. That registry was Ledger's door. But the armament was gone, and 9 years of patient rebuilding could only restore what was present. There were no weapons in the hull to find, reconstruct, or repurpose. Osai documented this explicitly in her project records, in plain language. Ledger is a listener that can speak. It is not a weapon. This is the extent and the limit of the capability. She did not frame this as a failure. It was a constraint. Constraints told you what shape your strategy had to be. The strategy was, hold a door open long enough for someone on the other side to make a choice. Year 7, Diallo was 41. Venkatesh was 38. The core of the Solen's Grief was fluent. Osai sat in the supervisor's cabin with the readout on her screen. the core producing Aurelian maintenance protocol in the full-depth register, clean and grammatical and indistinguishable, by every metric she had, from native compact output. She had spent 7 years working toward this moment and had not allowed herself to attach significance to it in advance, because hope applied in advance is the thing that makes 7 years feel long. The readout was clean. She poured herself a cup of coffee, set it on the edge of the desk, and read the readout again. Still clean. She had built a system that could speak the compact's own language back through the compact's own hull, still in the compact's own registry, never removed, waiting in the Pacific where Vey had dropped it as though it were a receipt. The most powerful administrative empire in the catalogued galaxy had handed her a door and walked away without checking whether the lock had been changed. But Ledger still had no trigger. It could answer, it could not knock. It needed the compact to open a handshake it could ride. She set the coffee cup down, picked up the file her research contact had sent 3 months earlier, and read the relevant entry again. The compact's century cycle fleet-wide decommissioning. A scheduled maintenance ping issued simultaneously across all participating registered hulls and obsolete vessels, opening a shared handshake for synchronized scrapping protocol confirmation. Standard administrative procedure. The next cycle, in 2 years. When she finally looked up, the light through the porthole was orange. She had been reading for 6 hours without noticing. She put the file down carefully. Then she opened a new message to the team, all 8 of them, and typed 4 words. 2 more years ready. The 2 years were the quietest thing Osai had ever done. Not peaceful. Quiet is different from peaceful. Peaceful implies the absence of pressure, and the pressure never left. But there was nothing to act on, so the team maintained. They ran system checks on Ledger's restored architecture twice a week. They updated the response sequence. They confirmed at intervals that the core was still holding its restored state, still fluent, still present, still carrying its registry identity in the compact's own records like a name on a list nobody was reading. Diallo learned to cook. Venkatesh started running on the platform's narrow exterior walkway in the early mornings, around and around, 40 laps before breakfast. The others found their own ways to carry the weight. Osai spent the 2 years writing documentation. Every step of the restoration sequence. Every piece of grammar data the rotations had produced. Every stage of the core's return from sleep to fluency. Not because anyone would read it, the 9 of them were the only people who knew Ledger existed, but because the documentation was the record, and a record was the thing that survived the people who made it. She did not write about what would happen if the decommissioning window came and the response sequence failed. She had calculated the probability of that outcome. She did not write it down. The compact's decommissioning cycle opened on a Wednesday. It did not announce itself dramatically. It was a scheduled administrative event, entered into the compact's public calendar 18 months in advance as standard procedure, routine notice, issued to 190 worlds and all registered vessels. Because the century cycle fleet-wide decommissioning was the kind of bureaucratic event that generated a lot of paperwork for a lot of aides, and advance notice reduced scheduling conflicts. 112 obsolete hulls across 3 worlds would participate. The shared maintenance handshake would open at a specific coordinated time, running the synchronization protocol across all participating registered vessels simultaneously. Vey's aides managed the paperwork for his sector. 3 participating worlds, 41 hulls in his purview, routine decommissioning confirmation forms. His aide had handled the same process twice before. In prior cycles, he had been part of knew the forms, knew the timeline, knew the sequence. It was the most administrative thing that would happen in the sector that month. Vey did not attend. There was nothing to attend. The cycle ran itself. At 3:40 on the Wednesday morning, Pacific Standard, because Osai had calibrated everything to her own clock from the beginning, the decommissioning handshake opened. 112 registered compact hulls received the synchronization ping simultaneously. 113 answered. The Solen's grief responded in the compact's own maintenance protocol, in the full-depth register, in grammatically clean Aurelian, riding the shared handshake the way a door rides a hinge. Using the registry identity Vey had never bothered to remove, speaking back to the compact's own system through the compact's own administrative infrastructure. The response sequence took 11 seconds. Osai watched the counter. She did not hold her breath. She had decided sometime in the second year of waiting that she would not hold her breath when this moment came. She kept breathing. The lock confirmed its second 11. 112 vessels, 3 worlds, all holding position under a synchronization lock that traced, if you followed it back through the handshake chain, to a hull sitting in 62 meters of Pacific water that the compact had filed as disposed. She picked up the radio and said, to no one in particular, "Ledger is holding." Diallo from across the room said, "Copy." That was all. Vey was reviewing deployment schedules when his aide's voice changed pitch. He had worked with this aide for 6 years. In 6 years, the man had maintained a register of practiced administrative comm that Vey had come to rely on as a kind of background sound, the voice of a system running correctly. Even bad news arrived in that register, even emergency communications. In 6 years, the pitch had not changed. It changed now. Fleet Marshal. A pause that was not a pause, the kind of gap that happens when a person's mouth opens and their understanding has not yet arrived. Fleet telemetry is returning inputs that are not originating from any compact terminal. Vey set down the deployment schedule. "Show me." The aide put the feed on the secondary display. Vey looked at it. Then he stood up and looked at it from a distance of 1 meter, because sometimes proximity to a display creates a visual artifact that distance corrects. The display did not change. 112 vessels, 3 worlds, all in synchronization lock. The lock origin did not trace to the decommissioning coordination terminal. It did not trace to any compact terminal. It traced to a hull in the compact's registry identifier still present, still active, filed under the Solen's Grief. Coordinates. Pacific Ocean, Earth, 11 kilometers offshore Baja Peninsula. Vey said, "Pull the Grief's file." The file opened. His own initialed closure notation at the top. His own disposal authorization. His own broadcast receipt, the 9-minute delay, the queued contempt filing. The survey assessment, core starved, hull stripped, armament removed, disposed into sovereign waste-tier waters. He sat down again. He ran the telemetry trace himself from the beginning because the alternative was asking his aide to run it, and Vey did not ask his aide to run something he did not believe the result of. He ran it twice. The trace did not change. The lock origin came back to the same registry entry both times, his own closed file. He ran the numbers. He kept running them the way a proud man runs numbers when they refuse to change. 6,000 years of administrative certainty. 190 catalogued worlds, a methodology that had never produced a waste-tier species capable of interfacing with compact architecture. A hull he had personally filed, personally broadcast over, personally initialed as disposed. Answering a maintenance ping, in fluent Aurelian holding his fleet. His aide was saying something. Vey raised one hand, not to silence him, to indicate that he was thinking, and thinking required a specific kind of quiet that the aide had learned over 6 years to provide. The aide went quiet. Vey thought. What the numbers told him was this. A species he had assessed as waste-tier had, in the 11 years since he disposed of a stripped hull into their ocean, learned to speak Aurelian maintenance protocol in the full-depth register. They had used his own discarded hull, still in his own registry, never removed because he had not thought it worth removing, to answer a maintenance handshake he had opened for his own fleet. They had done this with a hull that had no weapons, no navigation override, no propulsion control. They had built a system that could hold a door open using the compact's own doorframe. And they had waited 2 years after achieving that capability. He would learn this later, from the documentation Os had kept for him to open the door himself. He sat with that for a moment. Then he understood, with a clarity that felt less like insight and more like arithmetic completing itself, what a species that could do that much, with that little in that much silence, would build next, if given a reason. He did not have to imagine what they would build. He had equipped them with every piece of working Aurelian architecture they had ever needed. The grief, the maintenance protocol, the registry he had been too certain to clear, the decommissioning cycle he had been too routine to attend personally. Everything they had used was his. He looked at the telemetry display, 112 vessels, waiting. Then his secondary comm channel opened, not a frequency he used for external contact, not a compact standard broadcast band. A fleet channel. Internal. The channel his sector used for intervessel coordination. A voice came through. Female. Calm. Nearly bored, the way you sound when you have been waiting 11 years for a call and have stopped expecting the wait to feel significant. Fleet Marshal Vey. This is Dr. Amara Osai, Project Ledger Earth. I'll keep this brief because I expect you're already running the numbers and you don't need me to narrate them. Vey did not respond. He was listening. We're holding 112 vessels across 3 worlds in synchronization locked through your own decommissioning handshake. The lock holds as long as we hold it. We could not seize those vessels, damage them, or fire anything through this connection if we wanted to. The hull you disposed of has no armament, and we have never added any. What we have is a door we can keep open or close. A pause not for effect, for accuracy. Earth off waste tier. Formal reclassification logged in the Compact's administrative system. That is the ask. The moment it's filed, control releases. You'll see it release in the telemetry, instant, confirmed, clean. That's the whole demand because that's the whole capability we have. We are not asking for territory, for withdrawal, for an apology. One administrative change in a system that files administrative changes 600 times a day. Another pause. We're not taking your fleet, Fleet Marshal. We couldn't if we wanted to. This only ever holds and releases. It was never built to do more. Earth off waste tier. Do that and control releases the moment it's logged. That's the whole ask because it's the whole thing we have. The channel stayed open. She was waiting. Vey looked at the display. 112 hulls, already scheduled for decommissioning, doing nothing except existing in a lock that he could not break from his end, he had checked, while she was speaking, without resetting the entire decommissioning protocol from scratch, which would take 11 days. Which would mean 11 days of his sector's administrative decommissioning schedule frozen, which would require an explanation to his own administrative chain, which would require him to explain why a waste-tier world's hull was answering his fleet's maintenance pings in the full-depth register. He thought about filing that explanation. He thought about writing the sentence, a waste-tier species has acquired fluency in Aurelian maintenance protocol and is holding my decommissioning cycle hostage, and sending it up the chain. He thought about the file he would then be in. He kept running the numbers. Vey stayed with the numbers for a long time. The channel was still open. Osai was not filling the silence. She had made her case and stopped talking, the way a person stops talking when they know the argument is complete, and additional words would only cheapen it. Vey had noted this, registered it, filed it in the same mental column as everything else he was filing about this morning. He looked at the display. 112 hulls, 3 worlds. The lock steady and patient in his telemetry, going nowhere, doing nothing, simply holding. His aide had not moved. The man was standing 3 meters away, in the precise position he occupied when he was waiting for instructions, and Vey had not given him any, and 6 years of working together meant the aide understood that this was not an oversight. Vey reached for the carafe on the corner of his desk. The narrow-necked one his staff kept filled with water because he worked long hours and did not remember to drink, and poured a half cup he did not intend to drink. Set it on the edge of the display console, looked at it, looked at the telemetry, looked at the water. Then he authorized the reclassification. He did not route it through his aide. He pulled up the administrative terminal himself, navigated to the Compact's tier status system, the same system he had used 4 previous cycle reviews to confirm Earth's classification, and opened a reclassification request for the first time in 6 years of sector command. The form was not complicated. He had never filled one out personally. That was aide work. The fields were standard: world identifier, current tier, proposed tier, authorizing officer, justification field optional. He filled in the justification field. He wrote 3 sentences, then deleted 2 of them. The one that remained said, assessment revision based on demonstrated systems language capability, which was accurate technically in the way that the sun rose is accurate as a description of an event that is substantially more complicated. He submitted the form. The system acknowledged receipt. Standard processing time, 2 to 6 hours. He looked at the open comm channel. Filing now, he said. You'll see it in your monitoring within the hour. Osai's voice, copy, will confirm when it logs. Nothing else. She did not thank him. He had not expected her to. The reclassification logged at 6:12 Pacific Standard. 2 hours and 32 minutes after Vei's submission, faster than the standard window, because a tier status change filed by a flag rank officer with a clean authorization signature moved through the system without the usual committee review. Earth dropped off waste tier at 6:12 on a Wednesday morning, without press conference, without ceremony, without any public signal that the category had changed at all. At 6:14, the Solen's Grief released the lock. The telemetry on Vei's display showed it in real time. 112 vessels, 3 worlds, dropping out of synchronization lock simultaneously, returning to standard decommissioning protocol status, completing their scheduled procedure as though nothing had interrupted it. The whole handshake resumed and finished cleanly. His sector's decommissioning records would show a minor timing anomaly, a 94-minute processing delay, with no documented cause. In the Pacific, the Solen's Grief powered down, not dramatically. The restoration Ledger had built was not a performance. The sensors went dark, the maintenance protocol broadcast ceased, the core returned to something below even the sleep signal, a lower state than Osai had found it in 11 years ago because what she had built to run once and then let go. The hull sat in 62 meters of water, 4 degrees to port, dark and cold and still. Exactly where it had fallen. The 9 of them stood in the platform facility and watched the readouts go quiet. Nobody said anything for a while. Diallo made coffee. Venkatesh sat down on the floor next to her equipment rack, which was not where you sat if you were being professional, but nobody mentioned it. Osai stood at the central display and watched the last line of telemetry output scroll to nothing. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected something large, triumph, or relief, or something that mapped to either of those. What she felt instead was something smaller and more permanent. The way you feel when a thing you have been certain of for a long time turns out to have been correct. Not surprised, just confirmed. She had known somewhere around year 4 that this would work. The confirmation was not a new feeling. It was the same feeling, arriving as a fact instead of a calculation. She went and got a cup of Diallo's coffee and drank it standing up. Vei filed his final report on the incident that afternoon. He did not call it a defeat in the report, because the category of defeat applied to outcomes that could have been different with better execution, and Vei was not certain this one could have been. A species that could do what Ledger did with what Ledger had, a starved core, 11 years, 9 people, no weapons, no territory, and 2 engineers embedded in his own labor system under false registries so clean they passed intake, was not a species that had defeated him through his failure. It was a species that had demonstrated a capability his entire institutional framework had no category for. He was precise about the distinction. The report reflected it. He amended the original disposal record for the Solen's Grief. The incident file he had initialed closed 11 years ago, the one with the broadcast receipt and the queued transmission and the contempt line, and changed the status from disposed/waste tier confirmed to disposed/tier status, subsequently amended. He added a notation. This was unusual for him. His reports were spare. He considered annotations a form of uncertainty made visible, and he did not generally permit his uncertainty to be visible. But this notation was not uncertainty. It was the most precise thing he had written in 6 years. He wrote, recommend reassessment of monitoring protocol for disposed registry assets in waste tier sectors. Previous doctrine assumed monitoring unnecessary on grounds that waste tier technological ceiling precluded meaningful interface with decommissioned compact architecture. This assessment proved incorrect in one documented case. The error was not methodological. Available data supported the assessment, but the assessment treated categorical impossibility as a substitute for confirmed absence. These are not the same thing. Then he wrote the line he had been composing since he sat with the telemetry display and the half cup of water he had not drunk. Amend original threat classification. Not that this species was dangerous in the conventional sense, that it was patient. And note for the record that the distinction matters more than anyone in the compact currently understands. He read it twice. Then he submitted the report, because the numbers had not changed, and there was no version of the report in which they did. And a man who argued with numbers he had run himself was a different kind of fool than a man who had simply been wrong. He was not that kind of fool. The compact's administrative apparatus did not announce the reclassification publicly. Filing changes were not press conferences, but the record was the record, accessible to anyone with compact archive access, searchable by world identifier, logged with timestamp and authorizing officer, and the plain text of Vey's justification field. Administrators on 13 worlds pulled the record in the first week, not because they had been watching for it, because a tier status change authorized personally by a flag rank officer with the justification field actually filled in was unusual enough that the archive system flagged it as a notable amendment. They read it, they pulled the original file. They read the disposal record, the broadcast receipt, the contempt line, the survey assessment that said the core was starved and the hull was stripped. They read the amendment. No declaration of war, no seizure, no threat, no action. A maintenance handshake answered in fluent Aurelian by a decommissioned hull in 62 meters of water through the compact's own registry on the compact's own scheduled cycle. One reclassification requested. Control released on confirmation as promised. Several of them, in separate systems, in separate offices, on separate days, read the line in Vey's notation that said categorical impossibility is not the same as confirmed absence. No declaration, no demonstration of force against anything inhabited. No weapons, no casualties, no territory, just a door held open and closed on request. They filed their own notes in their own systems. The phrasing varied, the content did not. The Solen's grief is still in the Pacific. No retrieval order was ever filed, because filing a retrieval order would require explaining to the compact's logistics system why a decommissioned hull in waste tier, formerly waste tier, waters was worth the administrative cost of recovery, and no one wanted to write that explanation. The hull sits where Vey dropped it, 4 degrees to port, 62 meters down, dark. The platform 40 kilometers south was decommissioned. Quietly, properly, all equipment removed, all documentation archived in 3 separate locations by 3 separate members of the 9-person team who had, between them, produced the only successful tier status reclassification in compact history by means of a maintenance handshake. The documentation is detailed, each step of the restoration sequence, each piece of grammar data, each stage of the core's return from sleep to full-depth fluency. Nobody has read it yet except the 9 people who wrote it. No one has asked. Somewhere in the compact's administrative archive, in the record for the Solen's grief, the amendment sits in the file, submitted at 1647 by Fleet Marshal Saint Vey, alongside the disposal authorization and the broadcast receipt, and the contempt line he had cued before the hull hit the water. The amendment note ends where it ends. Not that humanity was dangerous. That humanity was patient, and the distinction mattered more than anyone in the compact currently understood.